Alright, guys, this is a long form version of What is a Woman? Obviously, you can see on the screen what it says. So, for a while, I've been wanting to make a multicultural type of explanation about what a woman is, and I don't know if this was before or after me knowing about Matt Walsh's What is a Woman, but um, I put it off because of some like disparity that was happening in the world, and so I just didn't feel like it was worthy to me at the time. But that was probably some petty nonsense at the time. Okay, so there's tons of ways I could cover this, and honestly, I might have gotten an answer already. He's mostly talking about adult human female, which, he's just talking about biology. But if that's the case, then he can't just be talking about childbirth because women uh, live longer than men, and obviously elderly women will mostly be around, assuming depending upon the healthcare system and you know, and so generally, I think that when there's multiple women and multiple men, uh, you don't really necessarily focus on the gender. Whereas if there was one man and one woman in the house and this defined who does what, and of course, obviously, everybody has roles. Women are still rearing the children, but in terms of multiple types of a different gender, like you focus on the personality, I would think, because there's more to go off of. And so this is why family was actually more important back then, because your child could uh, get their personality from different members of the family. If at least this is how I perceived it, and different interpretations of hunter gatherers and large scale families. Of course, this doesn't mean that, obviously, men and women still acknowledge each other as different. Like, this, it doesn't mean that just because you're focusing on personality, these differences are lost. It's just once it just seems that once it became more binary, it became more role based, and that defined the black and white narrative of how the state and eventually the market that became unregulated would see it. And I will be doing research on what I'm talking about with market deregulation. Bear with me, guys. All right. So, if Matt Walsh is talking about biology, then he's simply not talking about people who can bear children. All right. The grandmother hypothesis is a hypothesis to explain the existence of menopause in human life history by identifying the adaptive value of extended kin networking. It builds on the previously postulated mother hypothesis, which stated that as mothers age, the cost of reproducing became greater, and energy devoted to those activities would be better spent helping her offspring in their reproductive efforts. It suggests that by redirecting their energies onto those of their offspring, grandmothers can better ensure the survival of their genes through younger generations. By providing sustenance and support of their kin, grandmothers not only ensure their genetic interests are met, but they are also enhance their social networks, which could translate into better immediate resource acquisition. This effect could extend past kin into larger community networks and benefit wider group fitness. So, obviously, things aren't simply going to always be felt through simply uh, a genetic explanation. Grandmothers were felt as a stress relief for the mother and I guess the father, but usually the mother will always be involved more than the father potentially, unless it's like direct mate guarding. But I don't really think that mothers can really guard their pregnancy situation because they bear it, you know. Anyways, kin selection. Kin selection provides the framework for an adaptive strategy by which altruistic behavior is bestowed on closely related individuals because easily identifiable markers exist to indicate them as likely to reciprocate. Kin selection is implicit in theories regarding the successful propagation of genetic material through reproduction. Okay, so honestly, I wouldn't think of kin selection as necessarily just a genetic thing. I would think of this as a extension of the genes where you would no longer talk about the genes because they're the foundation, and it sort of spreads out as kin selection through larger bodies to socialize. So I never really thought about this in terms of continuing to talk about this in terms of genes. That's weird. Okay, you could say I don't know what I'm talking about, which is fair. I've read about this multiple times, but haven't really read about it often as my interests have sort of jumped from different things, as you can probably tell throughout my channel. All right, kin selection is implicit in theories regarding the successful propagation of genetic. Okay, just everyone's. Okay, this modeled mathematically as RB is greater than C. Grandmothers would therefore be expected to forego their own reproduction once the benefits of helping those individuals be multiplied by the relatedness to those individuals are outweighed by the cost of grandmother not reproducing seed. Evidence of kin selection emerged as correlated with climate-driven changes around 1.8 to 1.7 million years ago in female foraging and food sharing practices. These adjustments increased juvenile dependency, forcing mothers to opt for low-ranked common food sources, tubers that required adult skill to harvest and process. Such demand constrained female IBI interbirth intervals, thus providing an opportunity for selection to favor the grandmother hypothesis. Alright, so they become more useful outside of just bearing children, as essentially, like, since they can't just exist just in a void just because of their genes, this void is filled by foraging more, at least, you know. Alright, parental investment. Which, honestly, this makes more sense, but, of course, with the family breakdown, this becomes less and less necessary, and so institutions sort of reallocate populations so that more or less the elderly, for better or worse, honestly, because of I know grandmothers who have like Alzheimer's and shit, and it's terrible. Obviously, they need like professional help and whatnot. It's very traumatic. So even though that there is this for better or worse shift from nursing homes or into nursing homes out and the breakdown of the family through that, and so now we're single units, and you know, it just seems like it could just keep sort of backsliding. All right. And on top of the backsliding of family more and more into like even more single families, I just think it's sad that the family breakdown involves just putting old family members somewhere else wherein they used to just be in the family. But again, I can understand for medical reasons, law reasons, but I don't really care about the law that much, but I can understand it. I can, okay. Parental investment, originally put forth by Robert Trivers, is defined as any benefit a parent confers on an offspring to a cost to its ability to invest elsewhere. This theory serves to explain the dynamic sex difference in investment towards offspring observed in most species. It is evident first in gamete size, as eggs are larger and far more energetically expensive than sperm. Females also are much more sure of their genetic relationships. Okay, so it seems like most of this is just still a genetic argument for them sticking along much longer than usual outside of just birth. And so, again, Matt Walsh, if he's just avoiding this outright and is only focused on the birth decline and he's focused on women having children, he can be honest about that. And I'm sure there's like video evidence of him saying this somewhere, but I'm pretty sure there's also evidence of him being like pro 16-year-old, but that's just legal in like 24 states. So what are you going to do, right? Freaking sick country you live in. It's no wonder that we have this guy we can just throw rocks at while the country is actually promoting it. But, alright. Okay, reproductive senescence. So I think I've heard this before. Again, I just hope this doesn't end up in a genetic argument, but this was what I was always focused on, the alloparenting. So before I had a YouTube channel, I usually talked about hunter-gatherers and like the extended family and alloparenting, because I felt I was always raised by multiple parents, like more than two. There was always people that I kind of thought of that, and there was people who always gave me that in return. So I don't know. Like even though like culturally speaking, I never had like a father. I guess I had a stepfather who I loved, but society would judge that, and for the most part, I only had mothers in my life. So I don't know. The way I saw things kind of was different from this binary type of setting. And I kind of felt like it was sad seeing my family, like, and all the memories I had sort of just become more significant, you know? Now, I never met my grandparents. Like, I have memories of cattails in the fog on a moshy, like, scenario, and I was very young, and I was on, like, a bridge somewhere. And that's the last memory I have of grandparents. And that's kind of sad, you know? Alright. Alloparenting. The practice of dividing parenting responsibilities among non-parents' offspring females a great advantage in that they can dedicate more effort and energy towards having an increased number of offspring. While this practice is observed in several species, it has been an especially successful strategy for humans who rely extensively on social networks. One observational study of the aka foragers of Central Africa demonstrated how allomaternal investment toward an offspring increased specifically during times that the mother's investment in substances and economic activities increased. Subsistence, sorry. If the grandmother effect were true, postmenopausal women should continue to work after the cessation of fertility and use the proceeds to preferentially provision their kin. Studies of Hadza women have provided such evidence. A modern hunter-gatherers group in Tanzania, a postmenopausal Hadza woman often help their grandchildren by foraging their food staples that younger children are inefficient at acquiring successfully. Children therefore acquire the assistance of an adult to gain this crucial version of sustenance. Often, however, mothers are inhibited by the care of younger offspring and are less available to help their older children forage. In this regard, the Hadza mothers become vital to the care of existing grandchildren and allow reproductive age women to redirect energy from existing offspring into younger offspring or other reproductive efforts. However, some commentators felt that the role of the Hadza men, who contribute 96% of the mean daily intake of protein, was ignored, though the authors have addressed these criticisms in numerous publications. Other studies also demonstrated reservations about behavioral similarities between the Hadza and our ancestors. Alright, so there's a stat somewhere from hunter gatherers that uh, protein, as in meat, it takes like months, at least back then, for hunter gatherers to hunt something sometimes, whereas women who are foraging brought back most of the main foundation of the food because men couldn't be always out there killing stuff because it was so difficult, even though it was, they did, they were, and if they were successful, good for them. But I've read studies that, like, in terms of weight, the foraging they came back more with. All right. And so I think this 96% of the mean daily intake of protein part is probably talking about, you know, meat and whatever was killed. All right. Maternal versus paternal grandmothers. Because grandmothers should be expected to provide preferential treatment to offspring she is most certain of her relationship to, there should be differences in the help she provides to each grandchild according to their relationship. Studies have found that not only does the maternal or paternal relationship of the grandmother affect whether or how much help a grandchild receives, but also what kind of help. Paternal grandmothers often had a detrimental effect on infant mortality. Wow. Hmm. Also, maternal grandmothers concentrate on offspring survival, whereas paternal grandmothers increase birth rates. These findings are consistent with ideas of parental investment and paternity uncertainty. Equally, a grandmother could be both a maternal and paternal grandmother, and thus, in division of resources, a daughter's offspring should be favored. So, I've never really read this version of this hypothesis, but it does sort of sound better, or it sounds more along the lines of the genetic issue, but not so much. Alright. Other studies have focused on the genetic relationship between grandmothers and grandchildren. Such studies have found that the effects of maternal/paternal grandmothers on grandsons/granddaughters may vary based on degree of genetic relatedness, with paternal grandmothers having positive effects on granddaughters but detrimental effects on grandsons. And paternity uncertainty may be less important than chromosome inheritance. That's true. And I still think this, like, connection to relatedness, like, it's very sad. Like, I think we need to drop it. We need to just be adopting more people. Like, honestly, we're so obsessed, like, with having our own families, while at the same time, society is obsessed with not having you have big families. Like, it doesn't even, like, there's so much propaganda out there saying you're a strong person if you don't have children, if you say no, and I think you're strong if you do what you want to do. Like, assuming you have the right, I'm just saying in terms of development and, like, it, there's a lot of situations where people shouldn't just be saying yes to, obviously. It's just, people are judged, like a both sides way. And, alright. Criticisms and alternative hypotheses. Some critics have cast doubt on the hypothesis because while it addresses how grandparental care could have maintained longer female post-reproductive lifespans, it does not provide an explanation for how it would have evolved in the first place. Some versions of grandmother hypotheses have asserted it helped explain the longevity of human senescence. However, demographic. Okay, should I go back to reading senescence? Okay.
The mismatch between the rates of degradation of somatic cells versus gametes in human females provides an unsolved paradox. Okay. Alright. So, I kind of just like, despite the genetic issues with this and the focus on reproductive fitness, there is a sort of altruistic thing that gets projected through all of this. Because despite whatever quote unquote selfish genes, I feel like at the end of the day, like this promotion of more help in the family is honestly like a good thing. And I don't know why we would necessarily overanalyze it so much, except outside of resources and just population management and where to put people when family size is being reoriented. It's just kind of weird. Anyways, however, demographic data has shown that historically rising numbers in older people among the population correlated with lower numbers of younger people. This suggests that at some point grandmothers were not helpful toward the survival of their grandchildren and does not explain why the first grandmother would forego her own reproduction to help her offspring and grandchildren. In addition, all variations on the mother or grandmother effect fail to explain longevity with continued spermatogenesis in males. Another problem concerning the grandmother hypothesis is that it requires a history of female philopatry. Though some studies suggest that hunter-gatherer societies are patriarchal, mounting evidence shows that resistance is fluid among hunter-gatherers, and that married women in at least one patrilineal society visit their kin during times when kin-based support can be especially beneficial to a woman's reproductive success. One study does suggest, however, that maternal kin were essential to the fitness of sons as fathers in a patrilocal society. Of course, fathers are necessary, and all that it truly matters is that people are around you enough to help you survive. Of course, like I said, the mother will always be there with the child for the most part, unless there are institutions to take them away. For the most part, not usually. So I feel like men as fathers can come and go, but of course they're important and they're valuable, and it's very wholesome when they're involved in their lives. Okay. It also fails to explain the detrimental effect of losing ovarian follicular activity. While continued postmenopausal synthesis of estrogen occurs in peripheral tissues throughout the adrenal pathways, these women undoubtedly face an increased risk of conditions associated with lower levels of estrogen. Oh, jeez. Alright. Oh my gosh. Jeez, I was just talking about Alzheimer's. Alright. However, cross-cultural studies of menopause have found that menopausal symptoms are quite variable among different populations, and that some populations of females do not recognize and may not even experience these, quote, symptoms. This high level of variability in menopausal symptoms across populations brings into question the plausibility of menopause as a sort of culling agent to eliminate non-reproductive females from competition with younger fertile members of the species. This also faces the task of explaining the paradox between the typical age for menopause onset and the life expectancies of female humans. Okay, so I always thought that in general, overall, men don't live as long as women. But I guess in general, the menopause is a actual decline, but as men are aged, so do their hormones decline. So, anyways, that's off topic, I suppose. So, I've heard this explained in terms of other species having this grandmother hypothesis, like whales. But obviously, we're talking about humans. Alright. So, my friend, when I wanted to make this video about multicultural femininity was also going to be about sacred femininity. And I talked to my friend about this, and he said there was like geometric patterns that symbolized femininity and masculinity. And I never really got around to doing that. And I couldn't really find many like articles about this specific topic, but I grabbed one because okay, this is very relevant to what I wanted to do like 2 years ago. Okay. Symbols of feminine power have existed since antiquity. Symbols of feminine power represent feminine characteristics such as their caring and loving nature, the strength of character, and mental sophistication. Flowers, animals, and goddesses are among the numerous and prominent feminine symbols. These same symbols have been used to depict the feminine strength, vigor, and energy. Some of these feminine symbols, such as the moon, are inspired by nature, but others are more esoteric, artificial artifacts that continue to spark discussion and debate. Certain natural elements, such as the moon, symbolize feminine strength. Elephants and orcas have matriarchal inclinations and emanate a strong feminine spirit. Throughout history, flowers such as the rose and lily have represented feminine characteristics. Okay. The psychology behind symbols of feminine power. Femininity refers to the features and actions a society deems desirable for women and girls or suited for them. In contrast to femaleness, a biological and psychological categorization related to reproduction, femininity relates mainly to socially learned features and a secondary sex characteristics. Like, I just pulled up this random article just wanting a general background of symbology, and like this article is already talking about how, like, for the most part, femininity is just a social construct outside of like whether or not you can bear children. All right. Anyways, in Western society, femininity has historically been associated with characteristics such as gentleness and patience. To clarify human qualities and actions as feminine or masculine is to rely on the prevailing culture of any given country and essentialist concepts of binary woman/man. Traits that traditionally considered feminine can be categorized as biologically based physical differences. Some traits of feminism acknowledge the presence of a universal feminine that manifests in culture and mythology. The 1992 book Women Who Run with Wolves is a classic reading of the feminine through Jungian psychology. Oh, so I tried reading Jung before. I don't know. At the time, I could not get into it. I feel like this was more than 10 years ago, so um, maybe I could put myself into that. All right. Estes, a psychologist, poet, and cantadora, literally keeper of ancient stories, uses Jungian archetypes, hag tradition, and animal observation to construct alternative feminine mythology. She evokes imagery of a goddess delivering a child in a squatting position, quote, the sharp odor of iron from the flesh of blood of childbirth, the force of the haunches, and the spiritual placenta. She explains why, in her introduction, quote, over time the innate feminine nature has been plundered, pushed back, and overbuilt, she says. However, and goes on to say, woman waning energy can be revived through a thorough psycho-ecological excavations into feminine underworld. There may discover the deeper character of woman and have access to the creative feminine. A decade later, quote, Women Who Run with Wolves has returned to a world suddenly saturated with primitive images of women's bodies spilling with blood, running with hormones, and pulsating with anguish and excitement. Menstruation, childbirth, menopause, and gender change are frequently depicted in theater, television, memoir, and art. Instagram is overrun with photos of women frolicking nude through the woods and giving birth in living rooms with the hashtags like witch, wild woman, lalaba, and Spanish feminine form of a wolf related to consumer goods are abundant. So obviously, this totally goes against like the liberal notion of uh, strong woman meaning not having children and like saying no by any means. Like again, the World Bank, IMF, it's not a consent or a moral thing necessarily. It is the morals we learned along the way. I'm gonna continue saying this because I don't want to be taken out of context because you know there's layers to how social justice and human rights are sort of promoted. Like they're sort of given to us in a different language than how it is at the top. All right. Powerful symbols of femininity. The moon. As one of the most well known of the symbols of feminine power, the moon is considered feminine in whatever form. Consequently, it has been connected with some goddesses from different mythologies, including the Egyptian goddess Isis. Uh, Isis? Okay. The Japanese goddess Taikayomi, and the Greek goddesses Selene, Artemis, Demeter, uh, Persephone, and Hecate. Okay, I really should know these pronunciations, considering it's like probably so basic right now. All right. Several factors contribute to these relationships. The lunar month was frequently associated with the female menstrual cycle. Moreover, it is thought that the moon mimics the natural contours of the woman's body. In many civilizations, humans believed in the strength and feminine spirit of the moon, and they tapped into it by invoking lunar deities, the moon-related goddesses. Cats. Cats have coexisted with humans for millennia and have a sophisticated and graceful demeanor. In addition, they possess mysterious femininity that has always been cherished and revered, making them part of the list of symbols of feminine power. Cats provide delight and subtle pleasure that other animals typically do not. The physical look of cat is less macho than that of dogs. They prefer to bound with the moon than the sun. Cats possess a feminine allure as opposed to an openly male might. Cat's enigma, feminine characteristics, are creative and positive representation of femininity. Cats may also represent pregnant ladies, and their femininity is associated with the moon. Additionally, cats often represent the negative characteristics of femininity, such as cunning and destructiveness. Okay, so it may be inevitable that we had the Lion Man and other anthropomorphized like symbols of other human animal things, such as what we have now as like furries and like I don't know, this weird cat girl thing that it seems prevalent lately. Well, you could have seen that on Toonami back in the day. Like it's not just an internet thing. This was promoted like back in 2003. So in this there was a lot of shows back then where it seemed like there was this like cat girl involved in anime uh back on like when you watched Adult Swim or something. So I think as much as it's like this cringy association with the internet, like it's always been there. And it was like again, it's inevitable because of our like souls are either in the cow or we are anthropomorphized as the lion. So, humans were always weird furries. Okay. All right. Venus symbol. This symbol, commonly represents females and consists of a circle with a cross affixed to the bottom that makes the Venus symbol perfect for our collection of symbols of feminine power. The picture, known as the Venus sign, represents a Roman goddess Venus, Greek counterpart Aphrodite. The design is based on the Old Greek letters for Venus, the classical planet. A version consists of two interlaced Venus symbols, which are seen as lesbian emblem. Venus and Mars, according to legend, were Cupid's parents. It is a frequent portrayal of woman nowadays. It resembles a circle with a cross beneath it. The symbol itself depicts Venus, the hand mirror of the goddess. As Venus was the goddess of beauty and love, the statue is a powerful symbol of femininity. In addition, the chemical symbol for copper is also represented as the symbol for Venus. This is because copper was utilized to create hand mirrors in antiquity. Okay, I thought that was gonna say something gross like copper, like when she's menstruating. Ugh, jeez. You know, can't really blame me for going there when it's like everything about like the feminine, at least sometimes to a biological extent, is just like, here it is. All right. So honestly, I kind of thought that despite knowing about the sacred feminine, like I just thought it just put a bad taste in my mouth somewhat. Because there's other like genders out there that exist in other cultures and like strictly it just seemed like such like a religion, you know? And even though that the third gender is also like an intermediate of the balance of masculine and femininity, that was also like a spirituality. But again, with the way that things are, I don't know, just the romanticization of hearing something as like geometric femininity, like what would that even mean? Somebody walks up to you and says, "Hey, have you heard of the geometry of masculinity and femininity?" Like what would that even mean? That's just so silly. But I know now that it's like okay. Moving on. So, this is not so much a woman's identity, but the identity that is placed them upon them by men. Subservience, control, basically being like tiny, um, not the physical ones to do certain things. And anyways, I feel like there's lots of examples of this type of stuff that I could have brought up, but anyways. Two elderly women of lesser means, but notwithstanding, with their feet bound, golden lilies. In Boltalusi, Giuliano, uh, whoa, 1994, courtesy of the Portafiato Istituto Missiani Estate, Esther Milian, the Westerners who visit China in the 19th and early 20th century came from a male-dominated society where a woman's status was dependent on that of first her father and after marriage her husband. The law accorded her little independence until later in the century. She was perceived as the weaker sex, intellectually and physically, and even her clothing was such a nature as to impede easy movement. In this article, a number of original texts of the 19th and early 20th centuries, written by people staying and traveling in China are examined. However, it must be remembered that these are thus Western representations of the Chinese based on commentary experiences and observations. The quotations selected for inclusion come from a larger work and have been chosen for an historical interest and not because this writer shares the same views. The discourses frequently enact the superiority of difference. Their culture is not like ours and is per se inferior. What? It has not been my purpose to focus on Western ethnocentricity, but rather to represent some prevailing images of Chinese women. In the work which follows, the terms Western and Westerner are used as a convenient shorthand to indicate only the writers in English, most of whom were British or American nationals. In order to appreciate the stance of these writers, it is useful to know a little of the position held by women and girls in their own society. At the same time, I shall represent something of the debate on corsets and a latter material which compares tight laces with bound feet. My reasons for this are, firstly, that corsets are a sexual connotation as did bound feet, and secondly, that a number of the source writers drew parallels between the two. Attitudes of the source writers towards extreme tight lacing as a ridiculous and dangerous fashion led to view bound feet also as no more ridiculous fashion than while lacing was used as proof of the silliness of women themselves. Foot binding was generally presented as evidence of Chinese brutality and insensitivity. The lives of 19th century Western women were circumscribed by conventions and notions of property which most people of both sexes did not question. Few women escaped the representation of male dominance in the home, and fewer still had supportive husbands. But even of the expectations, but even of the exceptions, those who doubted the superiority of the male sex were not numerous. Mary Kingsley, who traveled alone all over Africa, who was befriended, not eaten by cannibals, asserted that Parliament was unsuitable for women. One Florence Nightingale, whose achievements and influence were monumental, opposed the women's movement. Some of the unconventional women were in favor of women's rights, but had reservations about the women's movement. Well, because at the time of the women's movement, it wasn't totally, like, sisterhood was a lie in a sense that not every demographic came together. It was mostly, like, eugenic feminism for the most part. Okay. If the feminist movement had its leader and its inheritance, reactionary forces were no less well supported. Sarah Stickney was an essayist, better known as Miss Ellis, and came to be regarded as an authority on women's matters. Having married the missionary William Ellis in 1837, she worked with him in the temperance movement. The essence of her philosophy was that woman's duty was to serve those around her, especially the men, and to provide a stabilizing moral influence which would pervade society through the agency of men, particularly husbands. As a woman, her most valuable asset should be her moral greatness. Her usefulness would be prized far higher than her ability to translate Virgil, and it was the quality of selfless devotion to the happiness of others which she should cultivate. Miss Ellis' view is an extreme one, but the concept of selfless service to men was, for many women, not more than natural. It was held self-evident that this was the fitting role for woman, in common with the use of scientific evidence to account for racial differences. The scientific argument that the cubic content of women's brains was less than that of males was used to prove their inferior mental capacity. This familiar and indisputable scientific argument was similar to the one used to prove that other races were inferior to the Caucasian. That woman was a relative creature was by no means refuted generally by women themselves. One of the ways of maintaining women in their place was the emphasis on property both of dress and behavior. Both were clearly prescribed in all situations to the extent that journals and books addressed the etiquette and protocol constantly throughout the century. For example, at the end of the century, Miss Humphrey writes, quote, "No one knows as well as women themselves how very inconvenient modern dress is. The only time we don't grumble about it is when we see a sister woman attired in rational costume. We compare those heel-less prunella shoes with our own neat patents. Wicked things they are, though, with their patent toes and narrow soles. We contrast their shapeless figures with our own smart outlines. We soon begin again to feel where the shoe pinches, perhaps the corset, too, to suffer from the weight of over-wide skirts, and to commiserate ourselves for difficulties with hats and hairpins." Yes, beauty is pain, as some people would say, or in this case, actually just saying straight up, what the hell is this? Okay. Dress codes were adhered to as compulsory if a woman were not to be considered vulgar, and even the lowest classes made such an effort as was within their means to copy the woman of society. A mandatory component of well-dressed woman's wardrobe was her corset. Not only did this garment constrict the body and give it the required shape to which Miss Humphreys alludes, it also carried deeper significance. All right. S1, the corset, the woman. All right. Somewhat like a suit of armor, the corset extended from the bosom to halfway down the hip. It was made of jean or buckram, well stiffened with whalebone in front and behind, and laced at the back, which was made with a rigid bone and steel busk. Some corsets had two padded supports for the breast. The aim of the corset was to push the breasts up and compress the waist and hips, as the fashion was to have a tiny waist, small hips, and full bosom. Mothers were advised that the most effective way to apply the stay or corset was to lay their daughters on the ground and pull the stay tight with the assistance of a foot in small of the girl's back. Jeez. So, okay, I think I've heard this before, but I don't think I remember hearing about the bones involved in this. What the hell? Alright. Alright, so this is patriarchy, guys. The power of beauty. Beauty is pain. And basically, this is being a woman. This is what Matt Walsh wants. Alright. Many kinds of corset were on the market. One which sounds particularly uncomfortable was called the divorce corset, intended to divorce one breast from the other. Oh, not husband and wife. Okay. By means of a triangular piece of iron or steel, padded and with curved sides, the point projecting upwards between the breasts, thrusting them apart to produce a Grecian shape. As for the pregnant stay, described in 1811, this completely enveloped the mother-to-be from the shoulders to the below the hips, elaborately boned, so as to compress and reduce to the shape desired the natural prominence of the female figure in a state of fruitlessness. Jeez. Fruitfulness, sorry. Total opposite of what I said. Oh my god. This is so terrible. This is almost uncomfortable to read, and it is I don't know. It's one of those things that just kind of makes you laugh because it's that terrible. Okay. According to Willett and Cunnington in the history of unclothed, corsets at the end of the 18th century and into the first decade of the 19th were especially tightly laced. David Kunzel, however, in a rebuttal of some statement in an article by Helen Roberts, suggests the subject of the tight lacing and corsetry has been the scapegoat of costume history. Roberts asserts the wearing of the lace corset was almost universal in England and America throughout the 19th century, though she admits that the tightness of the lacing was probably dependent on social occasion, age, and marital status. Her thesis points to a sinister purpose for corsets. The female was conditioned from the cradle to the submissive masochistic role of symbolized by the corset. Quoting extensively from English Woman's Domestic Magazine, she shows that defenders of tight lacing used the language of sadomasochism, speaking of discipline, confinement, submission, and bondage. She further suggests that some male correspondents were disposed towards cultism and fetishism with regard to tight lacing, and cites examples where men confessed themselves enslaved to the little waist. Wearing corsets, she says, also came to be seen as a moral imperative. That's just weird. Kunzel refutes the claim, however. It was not, as Robert states, the uncorseted woman who was in danger of being accused of loose morals, so much as the tight-laced one, whose practice was on occasion darkly linked with prostitution. It is Kunzel's contention that extreme tight lacing, far from being general, was only practiced by the vulgar minority of the lower middle classes. Excessively conspicuous waist, he asserts, was to pun upon and contradict Veblen, the design of the upstart, the vulgar, the non-yet leisure classes. 8. He argues, 19th century social conservatives saw in the tight-laced corset a sexually expressive device which they castigated as immoral and unnatural. All right. This may be the key to why so many men among the source writers of the study compare tight lacing with foot binding and have such evident distaste for the former. Moreover, none of the male writers even hint at the sexual connotation of bound feet, whereas several women mention a hidden significance but without supporting the opinion. Sorry. Wait a second. So, I mean, there's always foot fetishes out there. So, of course, there's some weirdo out there who's like, oh, yes, foot binding. Like, I didn't really think of the fetishization and bondage, masochism about corsets. That's just weird. Okay. So, honestly, literally never would have thought of that. It kind of makes sense now that I actually am being forced to think about it like that. All right. In addition, having introduced the parallel between bound feet and tight lacing, again, no discussion of the suggestions ensue. If Kunzel is right, this is because tight lacing, as opposed to the ordinary use of corset seen by many as beneficial, was an overt expression of sexuality, whether tightly laced or merely routinely constricted, and contemporary evidence, such as that of the undubitably respectful Miss Humphreys, shows that all corsets were uncomfortable. It is clear that both men and women found the corset's outline more appealing than the natural. Okay. Appropriately, most of the medical profession was more concerned at the health of women than whether they had wasp-like waists. However, this is not to say that they wholly disapproved of corsets. It was the extremely tight lacing of the latter which they found damaged women's health. Miss Capelan was evidently much influenced by her husband's views of tight lacing, and she quotes a medical book, perhaps one of his Dr. Copeland's Medical Dictionary, page 188, to support the efficacy of her hygienic corsets. Quote, in connection with the use of stays and usual mode of their construction requires some notice, whilst they are so made as to press downward and together at the lower ribs, to reduce the cavity of the chest, especially at its base, to press injuriously upon the heart, lungs, liver, stomach, and colon, and even partially to displace those vital organs. Oh, these noxious and unnecessary articles of clothing, these mischievous appliances to the female form, useful only to conceal defects in makeup, deficiencies in appearances, are rendered still more injurious by the number of unyielding or only partially yielding supports with which they are constructed on every side. These are the whale bones in the back and sides, and steel in front, extended from nearly the top of the sternum almost to the pubes. Oof. Damn, that's horrible. So I'm usually always coming back to learning about corsets. This is so strange. Anyways, Copeland describes the displacement of viscera and effects on the skeleton, but he also discovers another interesting effect. Quote, the metal part acts as the conductor of the animal warmth and of the electromotive agency passing through the frame. It carries off by its polarization into the surrounding air the electricity of the body, this agent being necessary to the due discharge of the nervous functions. Jeez. And women pretty much have to keep a straight face the whole time while they're going through this. Alright. Copeland appears to be suggesting, through typically Victorian euphemism, animal warmth, electricity of the body, and nervous functions, that the metal part of the corset conducted sexual passion properly out of the body where it could do no harm. Okay, that's not how I interpreted that, but sure. The ideal woman had to appear to be immune to sexual passion. It is probable, however, that the concept of lying down and thinking of England while the man performed his duty on top in the correctly missionary position was an idealized notion only. The large number of pamphlets and books available by mail order constructing women what to do in bed, how to avoid unwelcome pregnancy, and advertising contraceptive devices are an indication that sex was alive and well, if largely concealed. None of the writers of this study, however, allude to the sexiness or otherwise of tight lacing, though, as mentioned above, some writers hint at the real purpose of bound feet. While Isabella Bishop was traveling in China, she was delighted to discard her constricting Western garments, and even went so far as to say that the comfort of Chinese woman dress was some compensation for the disadvantages of bound feet. Oh, geez, seriously? Alright. I will be back in part 2, guys. Peace.